Again, thank you for joining us this afternoon for the second session of the AgrAbility Virtual National Training Workshop for 2020. My name is Paul Jones. I'm the manager of the National AgrAbility Project, which is headquartered here at Purdue University. Our topic this afternoon is on cultural humility, and our presenter, Esmeralda Mandujano, is with the California AgrAbility Project. Some of you may not be familiar with AgrAbility. It is a program that's sponsored by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and we focus on issues of disability in agriculture. Every AgrAbility project is a partnership between a land-grant university and at least one nonprofit disability services organization. Currently, there are 20 AgrAbility projects around the country, plus one national AgrAbility project, again, led through Purdue's Breaking New Ground Resource Center. And our partners on that national grant include Goodwill of the Finger Lakes, APRIL, which is the Association of Programs for Rural Independent Living, Colorado State University, and Washington State University. For more information about AgrAbility, feel free to visit agrability.org, where you'll find a large number of resources, including more than 80 archived webinars. At this point, I will turn things over to Esmeralda, and I will mute my audio and disconnect my camera until after her presentation, when I come back for the poll portion of the webinar.
Oh, thank you, Paul, and thank you for having me as part of this National AgrAbility Virtual Training Workshop. Today I'm going to be talking about applications of cultural humility in everyday AgrAbility. My name is Esmeralda Mandujano, and I am with the California AgrAbility Program out of the University of California in Davis. So I'm going to start off talking about culture. What is it? And oftentimes when we pose this question, we talk about what do you define as culture? And some of the answers that come up in this discussion tend to be around food, traditions, and holidays. Some examples are like tacos, sushi for Japanese people, and barbecue for people from Texas. And then we try to zoom in a little bit more into what is important in your culture. And when we pose that question, some of the answers that we tend to pose, that tend to come up, are family customs, foods that evocate childhood memories, or really any memory or food that connects you to a fond memory of yours. And once we have these answers, we go on to ask, well, what do you notice from others' responses? And oftentimes what is noticed is that really there are differences within cultures and individuals. And these differences often can also be uniting. So as I mentioned, most of what comes up in this discussion are the differences. A great example of this is the AgrAbility 25 Years, 25 Stories that AgrAbility put out in 2016. This was a booklet that brought together 25 different stories of AgrAbility program participants. And although all of them share the culture of being an AgrAbility program participant, they were also all very different. And I went through the book, and I pulled two of the stories. And in two of these stories, I could clearly see that, well, first, they're both AgrAbility clients, so they shared this kind of culture. And then also, they were both involved with horses, so they're involved around the culture of horses. And well, one of them was raising horses, the other one was training horses. And although they do have these two cultures in common, there's also a lot of differences between them. So when we talk about culture, oftentimes we take two different approaches. Cultural competence is one of the most common approaches to integrating culture into medicine or a social service providing agency. So cultural competence really is a foundation to integrating culture into the way we practice. And what cultural competence tells us is that it is achievable to become competent in somebody else's culture or in another group's culture. And that can really bring some challenges in the way that we practice, in the way that we teach, and in the process itself. So really, cultural competence got us to a place. It's very important. But in 1998, Dr. Jan Marie Garcia and Dr. Melanie Tervalon developed this concept called cultural humility. And really what it is, it's an expansion of what cultural competence is, and it is a different way to practice. Now, I'm not here to bash or say that cultural competence is not important. It is. It's very important. Cultural competence got us to a place, and then we need cultural humility to take us a little bit further. So here are some examples of why it is helpful to think in terms of cultural humility. And one of the reasons for that is that there are certain differences in the way that you practice these. So one is the view of culture. The view of culture, in the view of culture, you label things in terms of traits that a group has. You label groups in terms of traits. So that is an englobing way to look at things. But there really is no context for these categories, and there is no contextual frame as to why people are put into these categories. Cultural humility instead looks at the individual level, and it talks about how there are multiple contributors to culture and how it can, and that it can be changed based on the context, based on who you are, where you are, who you are interacting with at the present moment. And really, your culture changes. We have all experienced this because we behave differently, and we behave differently depending on our very own context. A lot of times, we're also changing as human beings. For example, I act differently when I am with an AgrAbility client than I am with my mother or a friend of mine. That all of that englobes the context changing around me. Then the definition of culture is also different. A lot of times when we talk about cultural competence, we're describing racial and ethnic minority groups, and this is how you end up with books about cultural competence that have chapters on health outcomes for Latino patients or health outcomes for African Americans. And there is a categorization process of people, a categorization process of problems, and a categorization process of evaluation, such as the ones that we may be doing when providing a different service than a medical service. And this can really lead to some problems. So this is why we try to move away from that. And cultural humility allows us to do that because it talks about how there are combinations of people and how they interact with the world around race, ethnicity, age, income, education, sexual orientation, class, abilities, faith, and more. So this is really talking about the concept of intersectionality, and intersectionality is telling us really that we're not monotone. There are many things that intersect to define a person. When we look at traditions in terms of cultural competence tells us that immigrants and minorities follow tradition, and cultural humility tells us that really everybody follows traditions. Now, the context of cultural competence has sort of a subtle underlying assumption that the majority population is normal and that we have to learn from other cultures in order to understand how they are different from our normal culture. This does not take into consideration the need to minimize power differences that may exist. For example, when we're seeing a patient or we're providing a service for somebody, there are immediate power differentials. And perhaps the example that is more common in which we can see this is the doctor-patient relationships. There are power differentials in that relation. So you can kind of get from this that with cultural competence, there's a promotion of stereotyping and bias in a way that because we tend to cluster groups together rather than a promotion of respect. A lot of times with cultural competence, you will see courses that are a few weeks, and at the end, we can end up with the feeling of, yes, I'm competent. Now I can provide a service to people of a different culture or background than mine. I'm pretty good. You can end up feeling that way after you complete that kind of course. Now, in terms of the process, it can actually be dangerous to feel at a place where you've completed a curriculum and you have the skills to provide a service. And the idea of cultural humility is that really there's an ongoing process in which you are trying to make bias explicit. Okay. And really the endpoint of cultural competence is that we're going to reach an expertise or we're going to reach competence. And cultural humility tells us that really there's a continuous flexibility and humility that needs to be practiced and instilled because we want to reach a point where we are of being so self-aware that you are flexible and humble enough to receive someone else's viewpoint or to be introduced to another culture because you are going to be grounded in what you are. And I really briefly want to talk about what humility is. Oftentimes, humility can be a word that is associated with a disadvantage, but that is not how it's seen in cultural humility. In cultural humility, humility is having a sense that one's own knowledge is limited as to what truly is another's culture. It is also other-oriented rather than self-focused, and it really drives forth this respect for others and a lack of feelings of superiority. And humility entertains the hypothesis rather than drawing a conclusion. Now, I really want to zoom into the cultural competences main limitation. The main limitation of cultural competence is that it can give a false sense of security, and that can lead to of professionals that are blindfolded from seeing the bigger picture because they may ignore clues or information that the patient or the person that they're providing a service to is giving them, because they may feel so confident in the skills that they have that they can draw conclusions from the course or whatever they know about a person's certain culture. Oftentimes with cultural competence, you tend to get a certification or something that says that certifies you have some specific skills, but really that should be taken as a basic understanding of that culture. I'm not saying that somebody shouldn't try to learn about the culture of another group. That's still very important. It's the basis, But what cultural humility tells us is that we need to continue to learn from that culture, that it's not finite. And cultural humility also tells us that, well, we need to be aware of these clues that we may be getting from our patients or people who we're providing a service to, and that we need to be vigilant. And what that means is that we're practicing being aware and actively, constantly doing this. Now, I really want to highlight that culture is very complex. And I like this quote from Audre Lorde that says that there is no thing such as a single issue struggle because we do not lead single issue lives. Now we're really going to zoom into cultural humility, what this framework is. And the cultural humility framework was developed by physicians who understood that they were the experts in medicine, but not the experts in culture of their patients. And that is something that can also be recognized by rehabilitation, and be recognized in practice by rehabilitation professionals, agricultural safety professionals, AgrAbility professionals. The doctors that developed cultural humility, they also understood that while the culture weighs heavily in someone's thoughts, beliefs, and choices, and that in the thoughts, beliefs, and choices that they will make for their lives, and that it is a process-oriented approach which considers who you are, your experiences, and how you live in the world. And how you live in the world and how you view the world through your own identities. So now, cultural humility has 3 dimensions to be followed by providers. And when I say providers, it's not just medical providers, even though this framework was developed from a medical model, but it can be providers of AgrAbility services, providers of DOR services, providers of vocational rehabilitation services, really anybody that provides any kind of service. And these 3 dimensions are lifelong learning and critical self-reflection, recognizing and challenging power imbalances, and institutional accountability. Now we're going to go into the first one. The first one is really a commitment to lifelong learning and ongoing critical self-reflection and self-evaluation. Then that us as providers, we hold ourselves accountable for constant learning and curiosity to understand those around us. And I think the part of curiosity is very important because being a curious person can really feed into wanting to know more, wanting to listen, and that's very important in cultural humility. And one of my favorite things about cultural humility is that it frees us from feeling that we have to be experts on others and their culture, which is really the counterpoint of cultural competence. It's feeling that you have to understand that culture. Okay, so a little bit more on self-evaluation. When we talk about self-evaluation consists of being self-aware, and in order to be self-aware, one must assess our own implicit biases. For this, Harvard created a tool called the Project Implicit Health. This project tells us that we only have a small window into how our own minds work, and the tool allows you to discover your automatic reactions to a range of physical and mental health topics, such as age, weight, disability, and language. For example, the test on age often indicates that Americans have an automatic preference for young people over old people. The one on weight often indicates that we tend to have a preference towards thinner people than thicker or fatter people. And these are things that we're not even consciously doing. These are not biases that people may be aware of when they have them. That's why they're called implicit bias. They're part of our automatic responses. And I really like this tool, this Project Implicit Health tool, because the tests are quick. They're 15-minute tests. They're not. They go by very quickly because you're engaged in the activity that they have you do in order to assess your biases. And it's really an important tool to call yourself on it if you if you're acting on a bias and you may not know it. Being aware of it can help you do this, can help you call yourself on it. So, ahead. When I first came upon this tool, I came upon it in a discussion of race. And in that discussion, when I took the test, fortunately for me, it came up that I did not have a bias in terms of races, but then I went on and I took the one on weight, and when I took the one on weight, my results came up showing that I had an implicit bias towards thinner people, and that really made me think about my job, my role in AgrAbility. Am I potentially not recommending a solution or an assistive device or a provider because I may be thinking that, oh, this person's not going to use it due to their weight or due to their lifestyle around like their eating habits. So that to me was very important to know, because once I was making the decision, making recommendations, I would ask myself, would I recommend this tool to this person? It's important. It comes up in our everyday AgrAbility. And then the test on disability is a fairly new one. When it came up, of course, I knew that I had to take it because in AgrAbility we work with individuals with disabilities. And I'm not going to lie, I was a little bit scared. I felt, what if I have an automatic preference for people that are fully abled? Is that impacting the way that I work? Fortunately for me, when I took the test, it suggested that I had no automatic preference between disabled persons and able persons. Okay. So similar to the concept of cultural humility, we can think of the AgrAbility program participant disabilities as a process because these change, evolve, and progress. In AgrAbility, the leading disabilities are degenerative chronic illnesses, and perhaps what works now, the recommendation that we may give them now may not work tomorrow. What they're feeling or experiences now may change. And in terms of the need of the assistive device that they may be needing, that can change depending on how their disability may be progressing. They can need more than one assistive device, or we may not even have a device that clearly comes to the top of our mind. We have to call other AgrAbility providers in order to get some of these ideas. And still, that assistive device might still be hard to attain. So these are things that keep us constantly thinking of new ideas. And really, like cultural humility, case management is a process. Okay, so now going into the second dimension of cultural humility, which is recognizing and challenging power imbalances. A culturally humble provider would have a desire to fix power imbalances between program participants and service providers. And recognizing and challenging power imbalances can be making an attempt to recognize when we are in a position of power and make attempts to neutralize this imbalance. And that can really, that's something that has to be constant when we're doing our AgrAbility work. We have to recognize by pointing out and advocating. That's one of the main ways that I like to implement this second dimension. An example would be that us as an agency or government employee, we are automatically in a position of power, and that can be shown by the type of vehicle that you use when you drive up to the farm. If you're driving a university vehicle, that immediately, or a government vehicle, that immediately sets a position of power. Wearing an AgrAbility shirt, or a shirt that shows the logo of the place you work with, it creates this immediate division between the individual you're serving and yourself because of this power imbalances. Even showing up with a clipboard can highlight that implicitly. That's why it's important to point out our own limitations and how we can advocate for the farmer or the farm worker. And for example, we can say, well, we think that X, Y, and Z assistive device may help, and we're going to try to do this to help you get that device, try that device. However, there may be some hurdles, or we may not be able to get it. So that helps also to develop a rapport with the client and help them work together with you. Now, the third dimension of cultural humility is institutional accountability, and a culturally humble provider strives to develop community partnerships to advocate within larger organizations in which he or she participates in. And an example of this would be working with collaborators. Working with collaborators of other agencies, oftentimes we all have grants, we all have projects, and we have project deliverables that often follow a script that we have to complete in order to fulfill our grant or job duties. However, that script may sometimes be limited onto how we can help a certain farmer or farm worker. And that's why it's very important to do joint advocacy between collaborators towards a common goal for the individual they're both serving. The result can be creating opportunities that may have not been there before. So really trying to understand the needs of the person you're serving, and trying to understand how other agencies can help you support their needs. And then you may just find that if you have an agency that supports a certain need that your client has, then that enables you and your organization to provide the solution that you're looking at. Institutional accountability can also look like in the community. It can look like working with community organizations. For example, in California, our AgrAbility program works with a work group of promotores. And what this is, these are people that are very invested in their community. They're community leaders, and really the main takeaway from this is that they put the time into the community. They take the time to know them, and they make those connections. We also work with government organizations such as vocational rehabilitation, and we work with them, again, in partnership to serve the needs of our AgrAbility clients. And in healthcare, that can be similar too. With rehab centers, hospitals, and clinics, we could be going out there to for a referral from a rehab center, but it takes knowing each other, knowing what the rehab center can do and what the AgrAbility program or other program can do. And really, institutional accountability reminds us to ask, not to assume. It's important to constantly ask your collaborators what are the services that they can provide, and never assume what they can and cannot do. This is just a brief list of our committed collaborators and supporters for the California AgrAbility program. Behind each of these logos, we can identify a person that works there by name, with whom we can talk to and sort through some of the needs of our clients. Now, recognizing and challenging power imbalances can be difficult, but it's a process that takes time. It takes involvement. In the following clip, we were going to show a provider practicing cultural humility through a community-based participatory research, which was done in San Francisco. This video can come off a little choppy for some of the users, but once this webinar is archived, the link will also be archived. Okay, so in this video, we saw that this provider who is practicing cultural humility indicates that it's important to show up, it's important to invest time, and that can be the time that it takes to get to know the client who you're serving. And this video also really emphasizes that culture is more than just a language. There are many cultures. For example, in terms of AgrAbility, there's farm culture, and there are aspects of the farm culture which will not be the same for everyone. For example, in AgrAbility, we often hear farmers say that they will much rather die on the tractor than stop working. And really, there are many reasons for that, for them potentially saying that. It could be that their farm is a family tradition, that the farm has been in their lives for generations and generations, or it can be that there's a necessity to feed their family. We don't necessarily know. We cannot project our assumptions onto what they're telling us. We can really only listen to what they have to tell us. And this is why oftentimes when someone comes to a farm and does an assessment and says that having a paraplegic farmer on a tractor is a hazard or a liability, if you have a provider making this kind of assumptions, the farmer will be quick to dismiss them because they have not taken the time to understand their environments and the reasons for which they are continuing to work with a disability. Now, I've been talking about cultural humility, and now we're going to dive into an example of providing and practicing cultural humility. This is the example that I've set up. Mr. Lopez is a 56-year-old male, monolingual, Spanish-speaking Latino farm worker. He lives and works with hypertension, advanced vision problems, and arthritis. He is not present at the scheduled site visit with you, the service provider, at his home. After waiting 20 minutes for him to arrive, he reports not having made his vision appointment last week and did not look into the resource you recommended to help him. In this case, it was breakaway tractor mirrors, which potentially could help him when he's on the tractor and he's feeling pain from his arthritis on his neck. So what we're going to do now is that we are going to look at what are the issues leading to Mr. Lopez showing up late and not following the recommendations. There are two different ways based on what we've discussed, so based on cultural competence and based on cultural humility, that we can look at what happened. Why is Mr. Lopez not following the recommendations? The first is cultural formulation, which is underlined by cultural competence. And if we do this cultural formulation, we would potentially say that being late for Mr. Lopez is just part of his cultures. Latinos are often late, and oftentimes it is said that they arrive like an hour after an event is supposed to start. So that is an assumption of a culture. And we can also, under this cultural formulation, say that he did not follow the recommendations to look at the breakaway tractor mirrors because he's just stubborn. It's part of his culture. It's part of him getting older. But really, both of these are false beliefs. These are assumptions. However, now if we switch and we look at the same questions, at the same question as to why Mr. Lopez is not following the recommendations, but instead we do a structural formulation, which is underlined by the idea of cultural humility. It could be that potentially he has limited income, and this is why he has to rely on rides. So he doesn't necessarily know what time he's going to arrive home. He doesn't necessarily know if he makes an appointment at 4 o'clock at his house that he's going to be there. Another reason could be that because of his vision problems, he has stopped driving, and that's why he has to take rides. And a reason why, under the structural formulation, that he did not look into the breakaway tractor mirrors is that he may not have access to the internet if you as a provider provided him an internet link or a brochure with some information and then a link to get more information. These are points that are based on his environment, not necessarily him. And you really only get to these by asking more questions, listening to your client. So now continuing to practice and applying cultural humility, how would a culturally humble service provider commit to a lifelong process of self-learning? This can really be having a provider ask Mr. Lopez, and again, based on the case of Mr. Lopez, asking him what's going on and not making assumptions about what is driving his non-compliance. So we can't just say, oh, he's just stubborn and he didn't look into what I recommended him to look into. And self-reflecting and asking yourself, did I ask the right questions, to try to figure out and sort what's happening. A culturally humble provider, under the desire to fix power imbalances, would involve Mr. Lopez in the decision-making. So that would be allowing him to say, well, you know, perhaps let's make an appointment after 6 o'clock when you get home from work. Rather than between the hours of 9 to 5, which is what normally a lot of people would work. And it can also involve asking him what he thinks are the barriers to him making it to his appointment, to him not looking into the research. And in this way, you're also really fostering the idea of becoming a partner to the person that you are serving, to your AgrAbility program participant or whomever you are serving. Developing community partnerships to advocate, that would look like working with community organizations to help Mr. Lopez access the resources that he needs. And that could be connecting Mr. Lopez to the local resource center where he can have access to a computer and look into what are these breakaway tractor mirrors. So in short, culture does not make people. People make culture. And this is something very important to keep in mind, because it is something that continues to come up and continues to evolve. So with cultural humility, we're not really going towards the idea of equality, which means fairness. We're really going more towards the idea of equity, which means sameness, and more specifically, providing the specific thing needed for the person who needs it. And this is really exemplified in this picture, where on the side of equality, we have everybody receiving the same box, but that does not necessarily mean that they can all see the game, which is their end goal. With equity, we have each of them receive some of them don't receive a box, some of them receive 2 boxes, and the end goal is that they're all able to reach the goal, which is seeing the game. Now, I really recommend YouTube has this wonderful documentary on what cultural humility is. In that video, there's different people describing cultural humility in different ways. Some of the words that are used to describe it are love, compassion, essence, open, listen, receive. And really, in summary, cultural humility is one more framework to contribute to what has got to be our ultimate goal, which is that there will be a sense of equity and a kind of respect that we are driving forward. So we talked about these two approaches of what is cultural humility and cultural competence. Cultural competence really is this idea that it is achievable to become competent in somebody else's culture, but that is really not something that is realistically possible because culturally we're all constantly changing. So the idea of practicing cultural humility and doing it continuously is more feasible in order for us to provide the best service that we possibly can for the people that we are serving. Now, I'm going to close off by bringing up this guide to practicing cultural humility through this acronym. I think it is a very good way to practice cultural humility and doing it in a way that is not as much information as what I have given you. So A is for ask questions in a humble, safe manner. S is for seek self-awareness. S is for suspend judgment. E is for express kindness and compassion. S is for support a safe and welcoming environment. S is for start where the client is at. So I believe before I end off here, I just wanted to do some acknowledgments, which are, of course, for USDA and NIFA for providing funding for our AgrAbility program, and to Ability Tools for being a wonderful partner of our program. And then here, I've just put some pictures of the clients that we have served, our AgrAbility program participants, and of us tabling with some of our colleagues at the Department of Rehabilitation and other agencies. And I'll now take some questions if there are any.
Thank you very much, Esmeralda, for that thought-provoking presentation and giving us a lot to think about as we consider our work and the people that we deal with. Two of the questions were actually comments, and they are related to information that's already in the chat area. One was the self-assessment from Harvard that she mentioned in terms of giving yourself a test in terms of biases. And so if you go to the chat, you should be able to see that URL. And then finally, Nancy Cruson also indicated that Gapminder provides a set of tools to learn about global people, and the gapminder.org website is listed there. Esmeralda, it looks like you're back.
I'm back.
Okay.
So I am not aware of that there are any cultural humility courses, like short courses. The way that I came upon cultural humility was from an article, and then from there I have found some courses, but it's like some longer courses, and then they just discuss the article of cultural humility from Dr. Jan Moray Garcia and Dr. Melanie Tervalon. So I think it's because it's a fairly new idea, only from 1998. it's just coming out there as an extension of cultural competence. So I think eventually it will be integrated into cultural competence curriculum, and I think perhaps what will happen is that they'll either teach them together, or cultural competence will evolve into cultural humility. But I'm not aware of current courses.
Okay. One other question I'll just read, since we were having a little technical issues there. Is part of culture humility recognizing when we need to refer clients to others because we're not competent?
That's a good question. I don't think so. I think you can always refer to somebody else if you need extra help, but you can still be involved in the process. You can just become a partnership, and that's the idea of institutional accountability. You don't necessarily have to shift your client to somebody else, but you can partner with another organization to help you fulfill your program goals and deliverables, and still supporting that client while you are working with an agency that will perhaps enhance the process and will help reach the goal for that client.
Okay, thank you. Very insightful. Appreciate that response. The other questions are actually comments on websites in the chat, and I mentioned that we've got the Harvard self-test that you linked in your presentation. Nancy Cruson has a link to Gapminder, and then she also provided a module from University of Buffalo in regards to culture. So those are available in the chat area. I'm just double checking our roster to see if anybody else has questions or a raised hand. It doesn't appear they do at this time. So Esmeralda, thanks very much for a very insightful presentation. I appreciate your efforts in this area and for kind of leading an effort in AgrAbility to think about cultural humility. So with that, we hope you will be joining us. Everyone will be joining us tomorrow and Thursday for the remaining sessions in the virtual national training workshop. And we wish you a good rest of the day.
Thank you.